Hello and welcome to Cloud, On-Premises, or Hybrid. Where are you making your BI investment decisions and why? Today's session will be all about understanding the Microsoft Business Intelligence Stack and hopefully finding your place within it. The goal is to hopefully help you understand your way forward as you look at multiple deployment options, products, and capabilities. However, when we finish up here today, I'm going to be happy if you leave just a little less confused than when we started. And given this topic, that's a fairly big order. So by way of introduction, my name is John White. I am the CTO and co-founder of a company called Unlimited Viz. We are located just outside of Toronto up in the Great White North, Canada. I'm a SharePoint Server MVP. I have been since January 2011. I'm also a SQL Server VTS with Microsoft Canada, so we kind of straddle both of the worlds of SQL and SharePoint from the Microsoft standpoint, which you kind of need to do business intelligence to any great degree in SharePoint. My contact information is here up on the screen. My email, if you have any questions outside of this session, if you forget something or you don't think of them while we're online here. My blog is at whitepages.unlimitedviz.com. On there, I go into a fair bit of detail, a lot of how-to stuff generally on some of the content you're going to see in the session here today. And my Twitter handle is diverdown1964, so please feel free to tweet out as we're going or at any point in time. And yes, that is me up on the screen in the background of the picture. That is what I like to do when I'm not doing business intelligence in SharePoint. And it also explains my rather wonky Twitter handle. But then when your name is John White, you're going to be using a wonky Twitter handle of some sort or another. Okay. Normally I'd start off with a demo of how tyGraph is built. tyGraph uses all of the components that I'll be talking about today, but time constraints aren't going to permit it. tyGraph is an analytic product for Yammer, and it's built on the BI stack. If you'd like a demo, I'd be happy to give you one offline. Instead, we're going to start by talking about some of the fundamentals of BI architecture. Now, if you already know BI basics, I'm going to ask you to bear with me. Every time I give one of these talks and ask for those that are familiar, there's a lot more people that aren't than are, so we'll spend a little bit of time with that. We're then going to walk through what Microsoft BI looks like today, both on-premise, and then do so from a cloud standpoint. Once we've got both of those down pat, we can look at the similarities and differences between those two deployment models, and then where hybrid deployments may come into play. We'll walk right down the on-premises stack and discuss what our migrations options are for the cloud, if they even exist. Then finally, we'll finish up by discussing some of the new tools that are emerging and have time for Q&A. Now, before we can understand all of the nuances of doing business intelligence, we need to understand a few basics. And by few, I really mean one. I find that when you attend one of these sessions, I do well to remember a few major points. So if you're going to walk away with one point from this session, and you don't already know this, remember this one. Please don't do a direct report of your data from the source systems. This is bad for a few reasons. From a security standpoint, you need to grant access to your source data system, and that's probably a bad idea. From a usability standpoint, you're going to be asking end users, if in this world, you're going to be asking end users to connect to your source data systems, and that's going to be confusing. Transactional systems are designed for transactional purposes, and they aren't necessarily designed with end user requirements in mind. Take Great Plains for an example. Any standard deployment of a Great Plains database has over 1,000 tables named things like S0005. It's not intuitively obvious where the data is. From a performance standpoint, it's not a great idea to have a whole pile of people reporting on data that's stored in a transactional system while the actual transactional users are trying to use it. We're just going to get into contention issues. And these transactional systems, as I mentioned, are designed for transactional use. And that's not always the ultimate design from a consumption standpoint. For example, SSRS likes to see data in a flattened format, but most transactional systems are going to be highly relational. So we're not going to be taking from a performance standpoint the best advantage of the systems we're using to consume it. What we really need to do is to abstract that data into a form that's going to be more conducive to reporting. What we're going to want to do is take data from our source data systems, extract it, transform it into a shape that we need, and then load it into some form of a data warehouse, data mart, or tabular models or data cubes for multidimensional reporting. That process is called ETL. From there, the data can be consumed by different servers or client types depending on the usage scenarios. Now, what does this look like from a Microsoft product standpoint? There are a few products that make up the Microsoft BI stack. They come from the SQL side of the fence to the Office side of the fence, typically, and now, increasingly, from the Azure side of the fence. It's somewhat of a bewildering array of tools to be aware of, to know and love, frankly. But hopefully, we're going to plug a number of these into the appropriate places in your deployment scenario. So you'll be aware today of some of the, or where these tools fit with your BI strategy. So we're going to start by looking at on-premises options, and that's the more traditional approach. So not surprisingly, the SQL product suite lines up rather well. If we overlay the products on top of the model that we just talked about, the source data is of course the source data. ETL is performed by SQL Server Integration Services, SSIS. It's the unsung product of the entire BI stack, if you ask me. It does all of the heavy lifting of moving data around. And you already own it. If you have SQL Server, anything above Express Edition, you've got a copy of SSIS. Storage is provided by the SQL Server database engine, as you may expect for both data warehouses and data marts. And the multi-dimensional storage is provided by SSAS, SQL Server Analysis Services. It can run in both OLAP mode, which is what we're talking about when we talk about cubes, or it can run in tabular mode, which is what we're talking about when we say data models, or what you might be more familiar with as Power Pivot. And on the right-hand side, you can see our consuming servers can be reporting servers like SSRS standalone, can be SharePoint with the embedded BI elements within it, Excel services, Power Pivot for SharePoint, SSRS running in SharePoint mode as a SharePoint services application, and Performance Point. They all reach back into back-end data to do various types of analysis and reporting. And then of course we can have client tools like SQL Data Tools, which is used to build the reports for SSRS, or the cubes and models for SSAS, or the packages for SSIS. You can have Report Builder, which is kind of a power user tool that's embedded within SharePoint when you have SSRS embedded mode for building reports. And you can also use any number of third-party tools like Tableau or ClickTech or what have you. So let's have a look at what some of the strengths and weaknesses of Enterprise BI are. The insights gained from Enterprise BI are highly curated. They're managed and they're automated, and they can be shown to be a single version of the truth. They are reliable. Enterprise BI is fairly expensive. There's a lot of moving parts and products involved with proper Enterprise BI, all of which require not only management and oversight, but resources and upfront design work. All of that design and build work results in Enterprise BI projects being slow to deploy. The problem with this is that no insights can be gained until the project is complete. It's a bit like building a car. You can't try it out until it's complete. It's very difficult to respond to changing requirements along the way. Enterprise BI can typically handle massive amounts of data. You're typically limited only by your infrastructure, and that can always be expanded. Really, the sky's the limit from a scale standpoint for Enterprise BI, although that, of course, comes at a significant cost. Given that the data is abstracted from its source, a certain amount of data latency is inevitable. SSIS can be scheduled to run on just about any time frame, even down to the minute level. The real question with data latency is how fresh does your data need to be? Enterprise BI affords you the maximum number of options for latency. Enterprise BI typically affords the ability to use fine-grained permissions, which is to say that the identity of the requesting user can be used by the data server to return only the data that the user has access to. Most team and personal BI solutions can be only restricted to the report or document level, and more typically will use proxy accounts to do so. Finally, enterprise BI is typically relatively static. Any changes to requirements must go through a complicated change management process, which necessarily takes time. Dynamic analysis is not the strength of enterprise BI, which is why personal BI came to be. Now, Excel is Microsoft's personal BI client. It always has been. In the beginning, users would just connect Excel to a back-end data source and do a great big import, all of those things that I talked about not doing earlier. Kind of gave Excel a bit of a bad name in the IT management world, but this changed with the introduction of Power Pivot. Power Pivot brings some data warehousing and data mart rigor to the picture, and users can connect a Power Pivot model to back-end data systems to kind of give them a mini data mart right within the Excel file. So to start with, we have an Excel workbook. In 2010, it's an add-in. In Excel 2013, it's actually embedded right into the client, although it has to be enabled. But we do have access to an embedded X-Velocity model. Now, using that add-in, we can import data directly from the source data systems and then manipulate the structure. The data is read-only, which is part of the appeal. We can't change it. We can trust that it's it's true, although it may be out of date. To that end, it can be refreshed. Now, really, what we have here is the E and the L of an ETL system, the extract and the load. More recently, a couple of years ago, Power Query was introduced. It was introduced as a part of Power BI, although it stands on its own. In this context, it's just a free Excel add-in, and that's true for Excel 2010 and 2013, but it itself will be embedded in Excel 2016. It brings a little more elegance to the import, or you could say it puts the T back in the ETL on the personal side. It has a host of other features and data source options, etc., but that's fundamentally what it is. Power Query can load data directly into the workbook, into the data model, or both. I strongly recommend you set it up to, by default, load data only into the data model, unless you know why not. Once the data is loaded, it can be consumed through a variety of tools. The traditional multidimensional tools are a pivot chart and a pivot table, and that can connect to both model data and data within a workbook. But now we have Power View for analytical reporting, Power Map for geospatial analysis, and Power Pivot in this case becomes the editor of the model. Once the data is imported, we can make some manipulations. Now, we want to be careful with Power Query when we're doing imports, because right now, if we're dealing with SharePoint on-prem, it can't be refreshed automatically. Only data imports made by Power Pivot in the data model directly can be refreshed automatically. That is slated to change in SharePoint 2016. Now, all of these approaches, both enterprise and personal, converge through SharePoint and dashboards. So, personal BI is almost the reverse of enterprise BI. Personal BI is usable by almost anyone. It lives within Excel, and there's over 1 billion people using Excel today. The tool is familiar. It's dynamic, simply because of the fact that the tool is ubiquitous and it relies on little other than data access. Changes can be incorporated on a user's whim. Personal BI used to have issues with confidence and reliability. The fact that imported data could be edited was not a good thing. Power Pivot has removed that issue to a large degree, although the question of data freshness can still remain. There's little or no curation of personal BI. The workbooks are in the control of users, in files, on a file system, and it's up to them to keep the data fresh. The fact that the data is cached directly within the Excel file, but not within the workbook itself, I'm going to explain that a little bit more later. This leads to governance concerns. Those workbooks can very easily be sent outside of an organization. Now, Power Pivot is much better than straight up worksheets at storing data. A worksheet can hold a little over 1 million rows of data, where Power Pivot has no such limit. Power Pivot's only limited by the amount of memory in the client machine. However, that's still a limit. Most client versions of Office are still 32-bit. That's partly because it's recommended by Microsoft to install 32-bit versions of Office, something I vehemently disagree with, but I'll deal with that at a later time. But because of that, the limit of the amount of memory that Excel can address is going to be 3 gigabytes for that machine, no matter how much RAM is actually in it. Now, even though Power Pivot can compress these workbooks down quite a bit, they can still get fairly large. On their own, workbooks can really only be shared by copying them around or emailing them to people. In addition, on receipt, the receiving user is going to have the same version of Excel and Power Pivot as the sharing user, and that causes complexity, and fairly often we have version incompatibilities. Finally, as mentioned above, Excel with Power Pivot alone offers no means of keeping the data refreshed. A user needs to manually refresh in order for the data to be kept up to date. So let's have a look at Team BI. Team BI is an attempt to give us the best of both worlds, although inevitably compromises to both have to be made. In the Microsoft world, certainly on premises, Team BI is centered on SharePoint with Excel services, and if Power Pivot's being used, Power Pivot for SharePoint. SharePoint provides document management capabilities. Excel Services allows for workbooks to be opened and interacted with through a browser. It also makes data connections with back-end data. Power Pivot for SharePoint is actually 2 things: a special version of Analysis Services, SSRS SharePoint mode, if you will, and a SharePoint service application that provides for the automatic refresh of workbooks stored within SharePoint. Here's how it works. A workbook containing an embedded Power Pivot model is uploaded to SharePoint. Once a user opens that workbook and interacts with it by clicking on a slicer, expanding a category, a filter, whatever, the model is uploaded into the SSRS SQL Server Analysis Services SharePoint instance, and a connection is made. This is no different than using a workbook that's connected to a regular SSRS server within SharePoint. A user can then schedule a data refresh through Power Pivot for SharePoint service. After that, both the workbook and the model can be accessed by end users using either a browser or by an Excel client. So, let's have a look at how Power Pivot works in both the Excel client and in the SharePoint farm. The XLSX file doesn't only contain the workbook, it also contains the XVelocity, or you could also refer to it as Power Pivot, data model. When the file is opened in the Excel client, examination of data sources will show it to be connected internally to the data model via a data connection. That model is really just a mini version of Analysis Services that lives within Excel. So, as mentioned before, data can be loaded into the data model, the workbook, or both. It's connected to from the worksheet if it's not in the worksheet itself. Now, if we take that same file in SharePoint and put it into the SharePoint farm, we use different elements in the SharePoint farm to do the same sort of thing. In the case of SharePoint, Excel Services becomes the presentation layer for the workbook, and it connects either to SSRS SharePoint mode, which is, of course, the Power Pivot for SharePoint, or comes from the Power Pivot for SharePoint product or component, or the data sources directly via an ODC connection. That's kind of the traditional way of doing it if we don't have Power Pivot. The Power Pivot for SharePoint service application is responsible for keeping the data up to date. Now, taking it a step further, if we tie both enterprise and personal tools together with SharePoint, we can create dashboards based on multiple elements. The dashboards can contain, but aren't necessarily limited to, worksheets and worksheet components through Excel Services, whether or not they're directly connected or through Power Pivot. It can contain SSRS, Reporting Services reports. It can contain performance point scorecards and KPIs, and performance point reports. And finally, we can embed SharePoint elements themselves. Things like filters, which are actually a BI component. We can cross-filter all of the elements on this page, making it a true dashboard. And we can put other informative web parts. In this case, you see a contact detail. Now, Team BI itself is, as I mentioned above, both a blend of enterprise and individual worlds, and it's partly a compromise. There's certainly more data curation in it than there is in pure personal BI. There's more eyes on the workbooks, and the files themselves are under management. In addition, the fact that the workbooks can be refreshed automatically means that stale data concerns are a thing of the past. In this world, we're still working with Excel, so the accessibility and dynamism advantages of personal BI are preserved. SharePoint provides for excellent document management, and Excel Services means that the workbooks are available from any client, or with or without Excel. They can even be accessed by Macs or Linux workstations. This solution is about as good as it gets from a sharing standpoint. However, it does have capacity limits. Excel Services by default is restricted to 10 megabytes. The files themselves are restricted to 10 megabytes by default, although you can change that. Depending on the version of SharePoint, the maximum file upload size is either 50 megabyte, 200 megabyte, or 2 gigabyte. The 50 and 200 megabyte options can be adjusted, but you can't get past the 2 gigabyte limit. So 2 gigabytes is the upper file size limit in SharePoint. Now, it was recently announced at Ignite that SharePoint 2016 is going to have a 10 gigabyte file size limit. So in future versions of SharePoint, that's going to be the upper size limit for models within Power Pivot and Excel. Finally, while the data in the workbooks can be automatically refreshed, it's not all that granular. The highest frequency that you can use to refresh a workbook in Excel is once a day. There's weekly, there's monthly, but once per day is it. One of the things I particularly like about this approach, or the new approach from a Microsoft standpoint, is this embedded X velocity model, or Power Pivot model. You can see that it forms a core part of all three approaches: personal, team, and enterprise. On the personal side, the model is a part of Excel, and all of the Power tools, Power Pivot, Power View, Power Query, and Power Map, are based upon that model. Frankly, if you see the word power, unless it's PowerPoint, it probably means works with the embedded data model. I can build that model with my personal tool, Excel, the one I'm familiar with, and I can share it out through SharePoint. And then all of these tools, SharePoint, Excel Services, Power Pivot for SharePoint, and Reporting Services Integrated Mode even, can work from that core model. From the team standpoint, I can then import that model right into SSAS. So that work that was done by the analyst on the personal side and proven through Team BI can now be promoted up to be an enterprise solution through SSAS, and they're all using the same core model. The beauty of this is IT no longer has to sit down with the analyst and try to tease out requirements and then go build what they asked for. You can let the analyst build exactly what they want and let IT do the curation. That is truly the best of both worlds. Now, we've been talking up till now about on-premises. What are the options in the cloud? Well, frankly, the options are a lot more limited in the cloud. The cloud is all about the data model. So it doesn't matter what we're going to be working with in the cloud, we're going to be talking about the data model. And there are a number, even now, of deployment scenarios that are available in the cloud. So the first cloud option we're going to talk about today is Office 365. You may wonder what Office 365 has to do with BI, but it actually has a number of BI capabilities baked into it. The features I was talking about with Power Pivot for SharePoint are in fact baked into Office 365 with the right SKU. I think it's E3 and above. And Office 365 lets you access workbooks with embedded models and pivot charts and pivot tables, and access them from a browser, and you can interact with them. So it's got all of that SSRS SharePoint mode in behind the scenes. You can even use the Excel web part to interact with some of these named objects, and you can embed them anonymously. So one example is I've got a blog post on Facebook, my travel last year in Facebook. I was able to use Power Query to parse that all out from Facebook and embed it into a data model, share it out in our Office 365 instance, and then embed that chart directly in a blog post so that you can go there today. I posted it in December and have a look at a pivot chart in an embedded Excel workbook exposed anonymously on a blog post. With all that said, there are a number of limits to straight up Office 365. The biggest one in my mind is the fact that you simply can't refresh the data. This is only going to work well for static data scenarios. The only way that you get to refresh the data in the embedded model is to download the workbook, hit the refresh button in the Excel client, and re-upload it. And that's not going to work in most situations. The other big limit is the fact that your data models are going to be restricted to 30 megabytes in size. Now that's increased from the original limit up until recently of 10 megabytes, so at least there's a move in the right direction. But 30 megabytes is still pretty small for any kind of serious analyses. So if your data is at all dynamic, or you need it to, or it's sizable to any degree, you're going to probably want to look toward Power BI. So what does Power BI give us? Well, when it was first announced, the biggest thing that I personally was excited about was the ability to refresh workbooks in the cloud in Office 365 from data that lives on-prem. And that's done through the Data Management Gateway. The Data Management Gateway is essentially a shim piece of software that you would install on-prem, and it manages the connection between the workbook in the service and the data source on-prem. That's one big thing that Power BI solves. Another big one is it increases the file size limit, or more specifically the model size limit, from 30 megabytes to 250 megabytes. Now that's still not big enough for industrial strength analyses. However, it's a significant bump from for what was originally the 10 megabyte limit and is now the 30 megabyte limit. And I want to make the distinction here is it's the data model that can be 250 megabytes. The file size, the actual size of the Excel file, can still on its own without the model not exceed 30 megabytes. The way that the service works is it takes the model and it puts it in what's effectively an SSRS box in behind the scenes. What's left over gets counted against that 30 megabyte limit. And that's why it's important, or one of the reasons why it's important, not to import your data directly into the workbook, but instead import it or bring it into the model itself. Power BI also has a mobile client available. It essentially is a window on top of Excel services in Office 365, and it brings to the fore all of your analysis objects like pivot charts and pivot tables, etc. It also has probably the sexiest offering in Power BI is Power Q&A, and that's the ability to ask questions in English, and English only right now, of your data in plain English. So instead of writing a select statement or something like that, you can just ask the service, what were my sales figures for last year? And you'll have to type them right now. Although, again, at Ignite in Chicago, a demonstration was made in Windows 10 of Cortana, of asking Cortana data of Power BI sources, and that was Power Q&A in the back end. Power BI is today delivered as an add-on to Office 365. So you have your Office 365 license, and you then buy, per user, another license for Power BI. And if your workbook is using Power BI features, the people consuming it are going to need that license as well. There's a slight exception to that because Power BI is really just adding on to Excel workbooks that live in the Office 365 service. As long as that workbook doesn't exceed some of the limits, a regular user without a Power BI license can do some regular Office 365 Excel services things to it. Now, when we look at what we can do with Power BI today in the cloud with Office 365, I would argue that we're talking about personal BI, and then specifically team BI is what we're getting with Power BI. It kind of falls short on the enterprise level for a number of reasons, and they're listed out here on the screen, and in no particular order. If we look at the data management gateway itself, yes, we can get data up into the workbooks in the cloud, but we can't do it on a frequency any greater than once per day. It's the same as with Power Pivot for SharePoint, and we consider that to be a Team BI service. We still have capacity issues. Yes, it's been increased from 30 megabytes to 250, but that's still not enough for large-scale enterprise deployments or enterprise analyses. A number of organizations still, and probably will always, depending on the type of data, have issues with data moving up to the cloud. The data management gateway isn't a live connection to the data source. It's updating the cache of data that's up in the service. So if you're dealing with sensitive financial data, for example, some organizations may have issues with having that financial data up in the cloud in the service, as well as, never mind the type of data, we may have issues with data sovereignty. People in whatever country may not want their data stored on a US or whatever foreign type of data center. There's no concept of fine-grained permissions in this in Power BI. It's no different than working with an Excel workbook. If you have access to the workbook, you have access to everything within it. And finally, there's a cost issue. If you look at a large organization, deploying Power BI licenses out to everyone within the organizations does tend to be a bit cost prohibitive. Up until very, very recently, when the new pricing model, we're going to talk about that in just a second, was implemented, it was $20 a month per user on top of an E3 license. So that's essentially doubling the cost of your Office 365 license. And that doesn't necessarily work if it's just incidental, if you want to have it out there for the entire organization in a consume-only type of fashion. So in part to address these concerns, Microsoft in January announced the next version of the Power BI service. They're calling it Power BI Dashboards, and it's still currently in a preview state, but it will become the new version of Power BI. One of the biggest differences that it demonstrates is there's zero reliance now on Office 365 or SharePoint Online. So instead of Power BI being an add-on service to files that live in Office 365, the Power BI service now stands on its own, and it can use data sources from files in Office 365. So it's completely pivoted its viewpoint. The other big consideration here is they've totally changed their pricing model. It's either going to be free or $10 per user per month, depending on the features that you're going to use. From an enterprise standpoint, I think a massive differentiator here is, we can see it today, the SSAS connector. However, there's going to be more online connected data sources available, but the SSAS connector is the first one. And what it allows us to do is, instead of, in the case of the data management gateway, where the data management gateway is updating models that live up in the service, this is actually allowing us to run reports in the dashboard in the Power BI service against data that is sitting back end. Essentially what happens is when the user interacts with the dashboard, a query is made that gets passed through the connector to the back end data source, and then the result is returned up to the browser. And this solves all sorts of problems. There's no scale issues because we can load up that SSAS box as big as we want. We can have fine-grained permissions. Should we choose to do so, because SSAS supports that. Identity is preserved on the way back in. You don't have to worry about the data living up in the service whatsoever. This makes Power BI, in my mind at the very least, enterprise grade at this point. We can, when the new version is finally released, we can talk about having enterprise BI in the cloud for the very first time. So let's have a look at what some of the things we need to think about are when we're going to move some of our BI workload up into the cloud. What are our options? What can we do? To start with, we can look at the tools and where they're available. and how they line up. We can see our entire SQL Server suite down the left-hand side, everything we've already talked about, including BCS, things like Performance Point, which I haven't outlined so far in the presentation. That's all on-prem. In the cloud, we have a number of tools: SQL Azure, SharePoint Online, Business Connectivity Services actually does exist in the cloud, but only if you're connecting to cloud-based data sources. Excel Services lives in Office 365, and we have Power BI, both the old and the new version. And in addition, one of the big questions that has been recently answered is what's happening with SSRS. Many organizations have a significant investment in reporting services, but up until recently there's been no presence for SSRS in the cloud. Or sorry, there was a service from Azure that was dedicated to using SSRS, but it was deprecated. It no longer exists. So what are my options, say, if I've made a significant investment in reporting services? And just to underscore this, I don't want to belabor the point. There was an announcement made a year ago that SSRS wasn't going anywhere, and again at Ignite, it was announced that SSRS reports will be supported within the new Power BI model. But if we have made an investment in BI on-prem, what are our options? Well, to start with, if we're working with Excel files, we can move our Excel files up to Office 365. We've seen that. What can we do if our Excel files are connected to data, as they would be in any kind of BI scenario? So just a regular data connection. Well, in the cloud, our Excel files can be connected to data directly as well. We can use ODC connections, but they have to be connected to cloud-based data sources. So how would we deal with that? We could push our on-prem data up into the cloud with a tool like SSIS, and then report from an Excel standpoint from that SQL Azure database. So that would be considered a hybrid model. We've still got on-prem data. We've got cloud-based reporting. We're working both in the cloud and on-prem. What can we do if our Excel files are connected directly to SSAS? Well, now in the cloud we have an option of using that SSAS connector with the new version of Power BI and that service. And that also would be considered hybrid, but we don't have to push any data around. We're actually reaching back in and connecting to on-prem data. If our Excel files have got small embedded Power Pivot models, we don't need to do anything. We can put our Excel files up in the cloud and work with them intrinsically. Of course, no refresh. If our models are larger than 30 megabytes, we can use Power BI. It's a license add-on to the service. If we have Power Pivot models that need to be refreshed on a regular basis, again, we're going to need Power BI, and that, again, we would consider a hybrid deployment. The source data is on-prem, we're pushing it up into the cloud. We're using both sets of infrastructure. If you've got a heavy investment in SSRS, SQL Server Reporting Services, we just need to wait a little bit. The SSRS support is not yet available in the Power BI preview, but we've been led to believe it's coming very, very, very soon. If you're using business connectivity services on-prem, what can we do? Well, again, it can only connect to cloud-based data sources, so we would have to use SSIS to push our on-prem data up to that. If you have a heavy current investment in Performance Point, I'm sorry, there's very little for you right now up in the cloud. There is a glimmer of hope. One of the things, there are two things that Performance Point brings to the table that you can't really find anywhere else. Analytic charts and grids, the ability to drill down on data within a chart or a table, and scorecards. And scorecards are essentially rolled up KPIs. Now, that is even being undercut as we move forward. I've seen some of the new developments in Excel let us drill around these pivot charts and pivot tables quite well. So that's kind of removing the requirement to build out anything special for analytic charts and grids. But what about scorecards? Haven't seen anything coming down the pike yet. However, the recent acquisition of DataZen, which is an on-prem, it's billed as a mobile reporting tool. But DataZen also has the concept of KPIs, and they have the concept of sub-KPIs. Now, I don't know about you, but the idea of a sub-KPI sounds an awful lot like scorecarding to me. So I would expect to see some of that technology rolled into the service one way or another moving forward. And that might give us some relief, because it does not look like Performance Point is going to be deployed out to the cloud anytime soon. I also wanted to point out that your choice of consuming platform is also going to affect your decision in how to get data into, if you're using into Excel, if you're using Excel as a reporting base. What you can see here, and I'm not going to walk through this entire table, is that some of the services that support some of the querying mechanisms. And I would direct you to my blog, where I've got a recent article that goes into a great amount of detail on the merits of using one approach versus the other. The net result of it is Power Query, if we're looking to move to the cloud, is something you probably want to invest in. And speaking of investments, we've seen a number of them coming out of Microsoft in the very recent past. Some of these are available today, and some of them are coming very soon. They were all very much highlighted at the recent Ignite conference. And these are all around BI. Azure Machine Learning, the ability to spot trends in data. Azure Stream Analytics, the ability to watch data or analyze data as it is coming in flight, as opposed to waiting for it to go static. So as opposed to the model I've already presented, where we have the ETL processes, we might want to look at data as it's coming in and have a snapshot of the most recent 10 minutes or something like that. Azure Stream Analytics brings that to the fore. HD Insight is Microsoft's distribution of Hadoop. And the Azure Data Warehouse, not available yet, but it was announced actually at Build, is a highly elastic, highly scaled data warehouse. So it takes the concept of regular SQL databases and it extends it out for massive amounts of data in a very scalable fashion. The Azure Data Factory is like a data bus on the backside of Azure that can connect to all of your on-prem data, as well as data that's stored out in the cloud. And it actually forms the backbone of the SSRS connector that I was talking about before, and will be the backbone of the data management gateway moving forward. And I throw up here DataZen, which was a recent acquisition, but it brings some pretty amazing visualization technology to the Microsoft BI stack. And the one thing about this slide that you should probably take note of is that of all of the items up here, 5 of them out of 6 are in Azure. These are all cloud-based, or at the very least hybrid. There's very few investments of on-prem. DataZen right now is an on-prem server. So it's not like there's nothing going on-prem, but the major investment areas are in Azure, in the cloud. So in conclusion, how do we get prepared for moving toward the cloud? To start with, we want to build on the tabular model wherever possible. It's the future from Microsoft's standpoint, and if we're going to be in the cloud, we're going to be using the tabular model one way or another. To do so, and when we do work with the tabular model, we should probably use Power Query wherever we can for data import. We have a number of choices for getting data into the data model, but Power Query seems to be the supported tool of choice moving forward as well, again, in the cloud. However, just because we're working within the cloud doesn't mean we should ignore on-prem products. We really should be familiar with SSRS. Again, it supports that tabular model, and it really gives us the ability to have enterprise BI in the cloud. It's a hybrid approach, but for the large enterprises, that is going to be what we call cloud, I think, moving forward. SSIS is how we can move data around in a hybrid fashion, so it's not just about populating data warehouses. And SSRS, our operational reporting tool of choice, is moving forward in the cloud as well. So we should probably be familiar with all of these things. And I do want to differentiate between SSRS and something like Power View. Power View within Excel or within SharePoint is an analytical reporting tool. SSRS is an operational reporting tool. And to put it succinctly, I'd say that SSRS helps us answer the questions that we know we have on a regular basis, and Power View can help us answer questions we don't know we have already. If we want to take full advantage of these cloud services, we should probably get our identity federated between our on-premise Active Directory and Azure Active Directory. All of these BI services at the back end take advantage of Azure Active Directory, including the per user permissions in SSAS, and they actually use effective username in order to pass the identity back to the SSAS server that's on Prem with the SSAS connector. And SSRS can use the set user command to do the very same thing against relational data sources. So we should understand how those things work. And it doesn't seem to have much of a future in the cloud. I would not put much effort into building new performance point investments today. And with that, I would now like to take any questions that you may have. Thanks for your time.